Jamestown is close to 400 years old. It started in 1674. If you calculate it, 1674, almost 450 years ago. It was the town that grew around James Fort. And James Fort was the last European fort to be built on our coastline. The Europeans came to the Gold Coast in the 16th century. The first to come here were the Portuguese, those we call the Potoki. The Portuguese came here looking for a route to India. They were very pleased to find out that there was a lot of gold here. Now, how did the gold get here? The gas arrived on these Accra plains sometime around 1300, 1400. The land they saw was not particularly fertile, but it had lots of rivers and lagoons. These rivers and lagoons were full of fish and salt. So they did the best they could by harvesting the fish and the salt. They also chose the land, which luckily, even though it didn't have much mineral wealth, was at the base of some of the richest gold mining countries in in Ghana, in the Gold Coast. That is the Akwamo, the Achem, the Asante. The merchants from these nations came down to Accra to buy fish and salt, and they paid for it in gold and other forest products. In time, when the Portuguese finally got here, they ran into a market that was heavy with gold. And they were very happy because that's what they were actually looking for. So a trade started. The Portuguese wanted to settle here permanently as traders. But the Ga Manche said, no, we want to trade with you, but would rather that you go and you come, like the sea and the land. The sea goes and the sea comes, the land is always ready to receive the sea. So let's keep that relationship. The Portuguese were not particularly happy. So against the wishes of the king, they built a small trading lodge. I'm told that it's located at Mensa, Guinea. The Ga Manche was very upset and he ordered the lodge to be pulled down. So his Asafo went and they destroyed the lodge and expelled the Portuguese. The Portuguese were followed by the Danes, the Dutch, and the English. When they got here, the trade really started. The Europeans at that time lived in a very dangerous political environment. There were wars in Europe all the time, and anytime two nations went to war, all their ships on the high seas were subject to being arrested and looted. So when they built a lodge or a settlement, they wanted protection for it. So they started pressuring the Ga Manche to give them land to build a fort, to protect their business. Successive Ga Manche men refused. But then the slave trade also started. And suddenly, slaves were coming into Accra territory, in Accra, and it was a very dangerous situation. So the Ga Manche finally agreed to give the Dutch land at a small village called Aprang. Today, that village is called Usher Town. But Aprang in the 17th century was called Usher Town. So, the Dutch were given this land and they built their little fort. Meanwhile, the king of the Gas, Ga Manche, had noticed that the whole trading with the Europeans was very lucrative. And so he wanted a monopoly on that trade. He wanted to keep the trade to the Ga people. So he made laws forbidding merchants from the interior from coming down to Accra to the coast to trade with the Europeans. This annoyed them so much that the Akwamu and the Achem, who were the main trading partners of the Ga, decided to destabilize the kingdom. A series of wars began, in the course of which the Ga Manche, Okankoi, who was the one who engineered this policy, was defeated. But before this happened, Okankoi had noted, Aprang was actually given to the Dutch by Okankoi's father, Mampong Okain. Mampong Okain was the husband of the only queen that has ruled in Accra, Dode Akaibi. Mampong Okain had decided to open the trade in Accra, and that is why he invited the Dutch and gave them land to build their fort. But his generals were not happy. His advisors were not happy with this particular decision. So, during the after his death, he also died in battle. After his death, he was succeeded by his son, Okankoi. Okankoi decided to continue with his father's policy. But before Okankoi came, his mother, Okankoi was very young when his father, the king, died. So his mother, Dode Akai, was elected regent. She took care of the country during the boy's youth. She also followed her husband's policy of trading with the Europeans and the foreigners. It caused a lot of problems within her council, and they decided to get rid of her. And all of us who have studied Ga history in the elementary school were told that she was a very cruel queen who asked her people to do impossible things. So eventually, they managed to trick her into a hole and covered her alive. That is the version that we have been given. Anyway, Queen Dode Akai died under these circumstances, and she was succeeded by her son Okankoi. Okankoi by then decided that having the Dutch alone as the European fort was not good enough, and he decided to invite the Danes, the Swedes, and the British to come and build their forts here, to come and settle permanently for trade. It was a decision that was not approved of by his counselors. and it cost him very dearly. He gave land to the Swedes, who began to build what is now Christiansborg Castle, but they were supplanted by first the Dutch and then the Danes, who took over the site and completed the Christiansborg Castle. In 1672, he agreed to let the British come and settle here. So he gave them land at a small village called Soko. Soko is where the lighthouse is now located. The whole area, Soko, the lighthouse, and James Fort. The land belonged to the Ejumaku and Adansi families. So the land was leased by King Okonkwo to the British Royal Company. And they brought from Lagos, from Nigeria, workers. They brought them from a town in Benin City, in Lagos, in Nigeria, called Alada. And this word Alada got into the Ga language as Alata. And today, we use the word to describe all Yorubas, Alata. But at that time, it was a specific group. So the Alata were the main builders in Jamestown. There were, of course, Gas, there were Fantis, there were other people who joined them to build the fort. But it was mainly the Alata. The first leader that emerged from this group was Wichekojo. He was a remarkable man. He, according to the sources of the British company, he was a servant who worked for them in Nigeria, and they brought him here as a foreman or to work with us on the site. This version is contradicted by historians of Malaysia Alata, who insist that he was not from Nigeria, but he was actually from Pram Pram, hence the name Wiche Kojo. Whatever the case, he came, settled in the fort, and he was so superior, so knowledgeable. He was such a keen negotiator that he came to the attention of his employers. And they make him a makelia. A makelia was an agent of the fort. You can actually trade for the fort. Eventually, he was so astute that he became their chief trading agent. He traded both for himself and for the English, and he made a lot of money. They all grew wealthy, and he became one of the main slave traders here on the coast. Meanwhile, King Okonkwo was having problems with the Akwamu. They invaded Accra in 1677, and they actually defeated the king in their major war, and they caught him and beheaded him. They cut his head off. And that was the end of King Okonkwo. But his son, Ofori, continued the fight. And the Akwamu fought him until 1680 for 3 years, when they finally won their war. The Akwamu, however, was not interested in running Accra. They recognized that the Gas were very good tradespersons and merchants and good negotiators. So they figured, okay, we'll let you run business in Accra, but you will pay us tribute. So each year, the Gas paid tribute to the Akwamu, who had now become masters of Accra. Kojo's Ngleshi Alata came to life, became a town just at this point. The Ga Manche was in exile. I mean, the substantive one had been killed. The young prince was busy trying to recover his throne, but he had not succeeded. So, Weche Kojo and his British partners realized that they needed to get close trade relationship with the Akwamu if they were to survive as a new Akucho. So they went to the Akwamu ambassador here in Accra, and he lived at Otu Blohum. The ambassador's name was Otu, and he had settled in a place and that had been named after him, Otu Blohum. They saw the ambassador and requested that they establish close business ties with the Akwamu. The ambassador accepted it. Meanwhile, in the court of the king of Accra, or the Ga king, their move was seen as a betrayal of the Ga cause. And the Ga Manche and his court never forgave Ngleshi Alata. It is a quarrel which has lasted since the 17th century. Up till today, we still have resonances of it in our politics in Accra. The conflict between Jamestown and Gamashi. These are the two poles. Even though there are other Akuche in Accra, these were the two most important. And their beginnings did not help. Another factor which led to this quarrel was the relationship between the Dutch and the English. They hated each other. Today, they are working hard in the European Union, but 400 years ago, they couldn't stand each other. Gavin, is that correct? True or false? 400 years ago, they just could not stand each other. They were keen competitors. So when Weche Kojo and the English went to the Akwamu to negotiate a special trade relationship, the Dutch, who were allies of the Ga king, told him that, look, you can't sit down and allow this to happen. Because if they get this special relationship, the English will now dominate your kingdom. Well, the king was in no position to stop Weche Kojo, but this feeling of betrayal poisoned the relationship between the two communities. This went on. The Akwamu ruled, were the dominant political power in Accra for close to 50 years. When they were overthrown in their turn by a combination of forces. Partly, the Ga grew tired of paying tributes to the Akwamu. They grew tired of being the Akwamu's negotiators, and they wanted out. So, they actually created an alliance with the enemies of the Akwamu, the Achem. The Achem was also an expanding Akan Empire. And together, they fought the Akwamu and threw them out. One other thing that Weche Kojo asked Otu was to teach him and his new Akucho the art of Akan governance. Don't forget that this was a period when the Ashantis were expanding. The Ashanti Empire was expanding throughout the littoral. So the Akans were very, very powerful. Many guys don't know this, but I noticed that when His Royal Highness was coming, the praise singer, the singer who was leading him, was singing in Twi. And this is not the only place. Any time that we have any function here in Accra, the court language, the language of protocol is Twi. All right. So now the Achem came in and helped to overthrow the Akwamu. The Achem were only here for about 18 years. Very short time. But slavery was at its height. And the town was very insecure. Even though the Ga merchants made lots of money, they also lost a lot of people due to insecurity. It had an impact upon how the Gas built their towns and villages. Houses were built close to each other with narrow alleyways between them. The whole point was to make it impossible for kidnappers to come in and kidnap people and take them away. The Achem were here for 18 years, and then they were displaced by the ever-expanding Ashanti Empire. The Ashantis were in Accra for close to 80 years. Now, the interesting thing about all these groups is that they did not settle to convert the Ga to their culture. They did not come in here as settlers. They were interested in the wealth that Accra could generate. And they believed that the Gas were very good at trading. So they were quite happy to leave them alone to do the trading, so long as they could keep paying them tribute for protection. And of course, the Ashanti also provided some protection against different groups that tried to invade Accra during this particular period. The Ashantis were thrown out after 80 years at the Katamanso War in 1826. Now, all these had an impact upon Jamestown, because Jamestown, as I mentioned, had come to being at a pivotal time in Ghana history, when the slave trade was at its highest, when the Ga king was making policies which ended up overturning his kingdom. The English Alata was established at a time when there was very little authority within Accra. And that is why they turned to Akwamu. They did not go there for political, to be granted political status. They went there for trade reasons. Anyway, so the Ashanti were here till 1826, when a combination of coastal tribes, that means the Ga, the Fanti, the Adangme, together with the Akim and the Akwapim people, rose up, formed an army, and tackled the Ashanti army at Kantamanso. The British and the Danes helped this force by providing some ammunition and a few soldiers. When you read the British history of the Gold Coast, they give you the impression that they fought Kantamanto War and won. They did not. They sent only 60 Marines from their fort to join an army composed of almost 4,000 troops. The Cantonment War also was a watershed in Jamestown history because it provided the opening for the mulattoes, the Euro-Africans, to come to the fore as players in the town's history. When this war was going on, at the beginning of this war, several of these mulattoes contributed arms and soldiers to the Southern forces. Prominent amongst them was James Bannerman and Henry Richter of Osu, James Bannerman of Jamestown, Hansen. Anyway, so after a while, the British were here. They were still trying to contain the Ashanti, but they decided that rather than walk away and leave this country to its own designs, they were going to colonize it, which they did. And this had an impact on Jamestown, because for the 200 years since the British had been around, Jamestown had been their main trading venue, their main trading partners. So once they became masters of the whole country, Jamestown, like they said, Jamestown had finally arrived. Well, they had arrived, but not for long, because now the British had responsibility for a whole country, and they could not focus on just one small portion of it. They started building infrastructure, and that is when the lighthouse was built in 1871, and then the wharf, the harbor, was added. Water was brought to Accra in 1914, and right in front of the Manche Agbona, on the other side of the street, there are two monuments, and one of them, the small one, is a monument to the water. Governor Roger was the one who So that's how the British settled in Accra. Now they started to build roads and infrastructure. Like I said, because the British were now in charge of the whole country, Jamestown had about 20 years, 20, 30 years when everything was coming through Jamestown. Then 1920s happened. What happened in 1920s? Gordon Gagisberg became governor, and he saw the country differently. They wanted to exploit the gold mines, the diamonds. They wanted to exploit the timber market, timber industry. So he built a harbor in Takoradi. When the harbor was built, it became the main export point for the country, and Jamestown started to sink. When Kwame Nkrumah built Tema Harbor, that was the end of Jamestown. Well, the story I have just told you is of a town that had gone up and down, and had emerged by the colonial period as the richest Akucho in all of Accra. Wealthy, it had survived political intrigue, it had survived attacks by its enemies, it had gone down, but it has resurrected. And what Jamestown faced now was that after the harbor closed down, nothing was put in its place. There was a small fishing industry which have not survived against the multinational fishing combines. So when we go through Jamestown now, It's mainly street food. But what has been overlooked is that Jamestown has an incredibly rich deposits of history. It has these wonderful old houses. Unfortunately, the Seaview Hotel, which was the first hotel ever built in all of the Gold Coast, was recently, they began demolishing it. The Temple House had been demolished. Adorso House has been demolished. And looks like the treasures of Jamestown are being demolished over and over. The only thing I'm going to ask of Oblimpong is if he can see to it that the treasures of Jamestown are identified. Gavin Cook talked about putting in money to restore James Fort. That's a great idea. It is a space that can be used for so many different things. The youth in Jamestown, who are the ones who don't seem to have much offered to them to create a living, can now be taught the history of their town through the buildings, through its streets, and they can set up tourist industry, guiding people around. So, my concluding remarks to you is, it is a town with tremendous potential. It is a town that has produced some of the best lawyers, doctors that this city has seen. It is the town where education in the Accra region, well, actually education began at Osu and Accra and Jamestown at the same time, in the 1830s and 1840s. The Basil Mission was in Osu, and the Wesleyan Mission was in Jamestown. And together, they educated a whole group of literate young Africans who entered into the civil service and the bureaucracy. The Basil Mission also taught young artisans how to build stone houses. So for a while, the only stone houses in all of Accra were found in Osu and in Jamestown. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Oblimpong very much for having given me this opportunity to come and talk to you about my mother's town, and wish you the best of luck in the years to come. Thank you.